Thank you everyone for joining me here today. And it's really a pleasure. As I mentioned when we were chatting a few minutes ago, I lived in New Jersey for 25 years and approximately, give or take a year or so, lived in several communities, Jersey City among them, and was active as a community volunteer and but also professionally worked in adult literacy or adult basic education uh, fields off and on in New Jersey during that period. Served on the board of NJALL for I think about 10 or more years. Worked with community colleges, did projects with the State Department of Labor and Workforce Development, Rutgers University, Heldrich Center. And I have a diverse background. I won't go into all the details, but what I'm talking about here today, and let me also say that I hope that we can make this as participatory as possible, since that's the topic of this, try to practice what we're preaching here within the time constraints we have and the technology and so forth. But I think what I have in mind is pretty much what Eric mentioned, that I'm going to kind of pose some questions to you and invite you to throw your answers and suggestions and responses into the chat. Maybe Eric can monitor them and share a few of them with me. And there'll be time, I hope, at the end where there'll be a more open exchange with you to add comments and questions. And I'm happy to communicate with you afterward. My email will be provided, etc. So thank you so much for inviting me, Eric and NJALL, and making this possible. I was privileged yesterday to speak in the opening session. And the things I talked about yesterday are overlapping with what we're going to talk about today. Yesterday, I talked about how our field might transition to a model that's more community oriented, and I'll explain what that means. But in a nutshell, what that really means is to be more responsive to more adult learners and respond to a broader range of needs, not just workforce preparation, which I think is very valuable for those who want it and who have opportunities to pursue new jobs or improve their job status and their income, et cetera. But adult learners have other interests as well. So, but woven into that is the kind of participatory learning and learner leadership activities I'm going to talk about today. So, these are interrelated themes, and this presentation and yesterday's presentation draws directly on a paper that I wrote, and Eric had provided the link to that in the the description of this session. If you want to check it out, it's a fairly lengthy paper that I wrote earlier this year that's really talks very much about what we're talking about here today. So with that as a quick introduction, I want to just explain. I'm going to structure this around 4 questions. What is a participatory approach to adult foundational education? And by adult foundational education, is sort of a new term in our field. Some of you have heard it, maybe use it. Some of you might have rejected it and said that's too complicated a term. I fully understand that. I didn't invent it, but I am using it here because it's an attempt. Let me just go to the next slide. It's an attempt to describe the field that we operate in. And, we are more than just teaching basic literacy and numeracy, although some of your programs might really focus on that very basic level. There's ESL or ESOL, there's high school equivalency or GED type programs. Basic digital skills are woven into these programs. And this is, I think, a growing interest and potential for our field and potential for funding as well. The Digital Equity Act, I've mentioned this before, is a federal piece of legislation which is going to be sending significant amounts of money to states to enhance access to digital technologies and digital literacy skills to accompany them. New Jersey should I hope every state taps into this, and adult literacy programs can, or adult basic ed programs can tap into it as well. So workforce and health and citizenship education is something that some of you do. And then our programs often provide many other supports, formal and informal supports, helping people get educational and occupational credentials, access to various kinds of counseling, connections to various support systems, health and workforce development and other kind of services, legal services, access to digital tools, and other kinds of equipment and resources people need for their lives as workers and family and members and community members, etc. So we're a big field. We're more than just adult literacy. And so without further ado, I'm just going to say, I'm using this term. You can use it or not, but if you hear me talk about AFE or adult foundational ed, you'll know what I'm talking about. So to go back to the structure of this, we're going to talk about, what is this participatory approach to AFE? What is learner leadership? And how does it relate to a participatory approach? How might participatory adult ed or AFE and learner leadership be part of the community-oriented approach or systems approach that I mentioned earlier? And then how might you apply these concepts in New Jersey? Many of you are already doing some version of what we're talking about, or are at least interested, et cetera. So we'll talk about that as much as we can within the time we have. So that said, let me start with the first question. And in the trying to be participatory here, can you just add in the chat, what do you think? What comes to mind if I said participatory approach to adult foundational education? I'll give you just a few seconds here to throw in your ideas. And Eric could maybe tell me what's there. I can't see the chat myself.
Oh, you can't see the chat? All right. Well, I'll monitor the chat. I mean, I think that, I think the Analia, I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Dialogues. Jeff G says a give and take between teacher and student. So that everyone, as always says, everyone can contribute. Richelene says that students help decide what's important for them to learn. Renee says students participating in their education. Jessica notes student driven. Students are part of the decision-making process as well.
Sounds good. You get an A in that those responses.
Suzanne says everyone has input, the thoughts, actions, contributions. So a number of answers basically saying that not only do students have us, being listened to, but they have a say in what's taught, and they have a say in the decision making process.
Yes, good. Thank you. All right, so let me throw out my own version of an interpretation of this question. I'm going to have a few slides about that. So you can see here, I've tried to kind of define it a bit and describe benefits and some of the sources, where does this idea come from? First bullet, participatory approach intentionally structures program activities to help learners achieve higher levels of control, responsibility, and reward vis-a-vis their learning, as opposed to, at the other end of the continuum or the lower level of the ladder, sort of passive or very limited token involvement. And let me just say that I wrote my doctoral dissertation many years ago was on this very topic, and I looked at how this participatory approach at that time was being interpreted and played out and supported in the United States in our field. And I used that as a framework for all my work ever since. I mean, it's now 4 decades. So that's one thing, and I could go into more detail. You can read all about it in the document that I referred to earlier, the nuances of this. And now, in terms of the practices and the purposes of this, I've sort of identified 3 categories of reasons for, or benefits for, trying to more actively involve learners in the program in various ways. One is that it basically helps learners learn more effectively, it also supports the effectiveness of the program. Because if your learners are actually helping guide you and supporting the program in an active ways, it's a lot better than just having a bunch of passive people come in and just in your classes and not be involved or support your program. So there's the effectiveness arguments. It's a more effective way to teach and learn, and more effective way to manage a program. Make it customer oriented, or learner centered, or student centered, or student involved. Another benefit is that it can help with the personal development or growth of individuals. It can help them develop a self-efficacy and other kinds of attitudinal and practical skills that they can use as individuals to apply in various aspects of their life. And third is that it can help learners more effectively be involved in the various communities that they interact with. So it's a sort of a social change. There's a social benefit by having more actively involved citizens in our country in various kinds of life contexts, in their family, in their workplaces, in their communities, in the democratic processes, and so forth. So these are some of the arguments for a participatory approach. It draws on a number of sources, research in how adults learn, and social psychology, democratic community development, and other kinds of sources. And finally, it was and continues to be developed in a number of venues. Back in the olden days, when I did my dissertation, it was in what we were commonly calling community-based programs. These are sort of independent, typically small community programs that typically would have a kind of social justice orientation. This idea of social justice wasn't something that was invented, just in the aftermath of George Floyd, but it's been around a long time and in various forms. And back in those days, that was in the kind of the tail end of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam, protests and anti-war movement and so forth of the 60s and 70s, leading into the 80s. A lot of those programs came with a similar kind of social justice orientation. Another type of program was the volunteer adult literacy programs. Now, it's pro-literacy at the national level, and you have Literacy New Jersey there in New Jersey. At that time, it was Literacy Volunteers of America and Laubach Literacy Action. Those were two national volunteer groups, which later merged to become pro-literacy. But there was a whole segment of those volunteer programs that were very interested in moving toward a more participatory approach. And it was a big transformation within the volunteer movement. So there were those kinds of programs, and in some workplace programs, including union-based programs, we're trying this out in various ways. Health education programs were incorporating student leadership and participatory learning in them. There were learner leadership initiatives that kind of grew at state and national levels. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, but they eventually grew into what was called Value USA, which was a national organization that I and David Rosen, who's also a presenter later today, he and I and some others work with adult learners to start a national organization, which lasted up until this year. I mean, it was there for 27 years and it just closed this year, and it closed this month. It's actually kind of poignant that it's closing. It basically ran out of money and it ran out of support. So, and some of you might have known about Value. So I know there's student leadership related activities on Saturday in particular in the conference. So the idea has continued even though Value USA is closing. And then in recent activities like the Teaching the Skills That Matter in Adult Education initiative of the U.S. Department of Education, you might be very familiar with that. If not, I recommend you look into it. I think they have kind of kept this idea alive of participatory learning. They might not call it that. Maybe they're calling it student-centered or learner-centered. I'm not sure. Active learning. There's different names that could be thrown out at this. But so there have been quite a number of initiatives that have supported this, the development of these ideas, and the resources from those are still around. And I tried to summarize them in that paper that I referred to earlier. With that said, as an introduction, I mentioned that learners, the idea of participatory education is that there's a fundamental idea that learners should be involved and participate at higher levels rather than at just sort of very passive or modest or meager participation. And I've divided the ways they can participate into two parts of the program. One is in the instructional activities. You think of this as the meat and potatoes of, the purpose and the focus of adult foundational ed, adult literacy, adult basic ed, ESOL, GED programs. I mean, the teaching, right? That's what our programs do. They run instructional activities of various types. So in that important side of the program, learners can be involved in these ways. And you've already mentioned that the people who added those comments in the chat. One is setting learning goals, where you're adult learners are actually asked to give input into why they came to the program, what their problems are in terms of basic skills, what they need to focus on, and their suggestions and so forth. And in turn, programs respond to those and try to customize the program to those particular goals. So learners can be asked and invited in various ways to, and good teachers do this. There are various kinds of activities that can be used to elicit and encourage learner involvement in not just setting their initial goals in some broad way, but over time to continually refine and reflect on what they're learning and where they go next. Actively participating, practicing the application of basic skills and related content knowledge through, participating in authentic and meaningful tasks that they might face in work, family, pardon my typo here, lifelong learning and community roles. And they can do that through project-based learning, various kinds of games, simulations, creation of student publications. Eric, I think, is very involved in student writing projects that'll be talked about, I believe, on Saturday. Some learners create videos, they do skits, etc. And my guess is you folks on this call or on this Zoom call are very, might be using many of these kinds of things. And there's many types of participatory practices to get people involved in applying what they need to learn to authentic kind of tasks, not just filling in a lot of blanks in a workbook, but practicing and applying and reflecting and fine-tuning what they're learning through practice. Another type of instructional activity, a role for learners, is serving as teachers' assistants, or either paid or unpaid. We're helping the teacher in the classroom, being peer mentors to fellow learners, working in small groups and sharing ideas, etc. Creators of teaching materials. Some students do that, especially student writing activities. They serve as resource persons. They might have expertise on somewhat, incredible amount of things, and they're called on to advise other students or staff on particular topics that they as students are familiar with. And I mentioned the word evaluators, maybe not doing a formal evaluation, but helping with the evaluation of various aspects of the program, the instructional component, giving feedback to staff and so forth on how to better improve the instructional process. And really a key thing is reflection, where you're encouraging students to reflect on what they're learning, what's going on in the classes, what are they achieving, and taking in turn responsibility for making needed adjustments in how they're studying. Should they be studying more? Should they be practicing this more in the community? And otherwise advancing in their learning. So that's a quick summary. Let me ask, are there, again, in the chat, are there examples that you can mention in New Jersey other than the ones that were already mentioned in the chat? One or two from you folks?
Right. And I think, Paul, per your point, it may be a situation where somebody hadn't necessarily given that label to their work, right? Or,
Right.
Conceptualized it in that work, but we're still doing that, recognizing the role that students can play in a variety of positions.
Good. I'm looking at the time here, so I am going to just jump ahead to the next part of this. So the other part is program management. I mentioned the instructional side of the program, but the program management or administration activities. And learners can, either as individuals or in student committees of some type, they can evaluate the program more broadly, give advice, be called on formally or informally to give input, and how can we make this program better. They can participate as helpers, not only in the classroom, but in other kinds of activities outside the classroom. And sometimes as paid staff. And I know some programs in New Jersey, I worked in some myself, in which I can think of two of the very best students, teachers we ever had were former students. These were ESOL students who had come up through the ranks in that program and went on to become, paid instructors and, advancing in their education, are now working in education full time. It's become a career for them. So, and they were just terrific people and terrific teachers. And also in terms of other kinds of roles, there's advising staff I've mentioned on just topics, questions that come up that the staff need some input on, carrying out various kinds of student-related or student-run activities, social or otherwise, doing little fundraising activities, going on field trips, graduation ceremonies. I mean, there's a lot of kinds of activities that students can run and contribute to the program and to their own learning. They can certainly serve as recruiters of other learners, and in fact, if I recall correctly, probably the most effective tool for recruitment that a program can have is word of mouth from satisfied students who succeeded in that program and see a value, and they get the word out to their colleagues and friends in the community. Publicizing and advocating for the program in more formal ways, in public awareness activities, outreach to policymakers and funders and so forth. So these are some of the activities that learners can participate in at higher levels. So these are practical ways of putting that participatory philosophy to work. Let me jump ahead. So this brings us to learner leadership, and I've talked about, well, let me just ask you, when I say this term learner leadership, what do you think? Throw some ideas. What comes to mind? Some examples or ways that students can serve as learners or be taught to be better learners.
Well, while people are putting stuff in the chat, the previous session was folks from Make the Road, New Jersey, and they actually have a leadership academy for people that are in the organization, right? So that folks can become more confident when going to speak at public hearings, right? Or when involved in other advocacy efforts. So, explicitly and intentionally helping members of the organization who are students and who are learners be able to step forward in ways that are productive and powerful.
That's a terrific example.
Yeah. So in the chat, there's folks about students really taking the lead and encouraging others, right? Students who have kind of higher levels of ability or self-confidence to encourage others, and to mentoring other students. And that prioritizing teaching and learning as a top priority for them and their program.
Good ideas. Yes, I think peer mentoring and encouragement is key. Teamwork. It's probably one of, not only in terms of recruitment, but in terms of retention, that kind of peer support and positive social support that a program can provide is really key.
Right. And one other suggestion, Paul, was about how some students can serve as group leaders in group discussions, right? So rather than discussions always being led by teachers, right, that the students can take the lead in facilitating and organizing the discussions.
Nice. Yes. Yes, it goes back to kind of like small group learning, et cetera. These are really venues for people to step up and take kind of leadership, roles. Anything else, Eric, that comes on the chat? Yeah.
I think
Well,
that sums up most of it.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. So I'll give my own quick overview. Participatory activities that I've just mentioned can be seen as ways to build the leadership skills that adult learners can apply, both as individuals and others, to the strengthening, moving outside the program. The program can be a venue where people can field test and try out and in a safe environment and develop kind of leadership skills. The idea is it's not just what they can do for the program as a public spokesperson. I mean, these are all great things to do for many reasons, for the program and for the learners themselves. But the idea here is that adult basic skills programs can see leadership development as a potential outcome of their program. And by leadership, I'm not saying necessarily what often is thought of as leadership, like the guy or woman up on a horse, with the sword in the park. All of us need leadership skills. I mean, another way of saying leadership is to be an effective, active problem solver and contributor to the improvement of the various contexts or what might be called communities that they operate in. The community of their family, the community of their workplace, of their labor union, of the neighborhood group, the religious organization that they're part of, the K-12 school, the PTA, or so there's a lot of venues that all of us, as adults, can interact with, and we all need problem solving, collaborative problem solving. For me, that's closer to a definition of leadership. Working with other people to solve problems and to improve situations that we encounter in various parts of our life, rather than just be passive, victims or gripers and complainers about the things around us. What can we do to help solve problems and make things happen in positive ways? So, the argument is that participatory education can produce benefits not just for the learner's ability to learn and for the program, but for communities that our adult learners interact with. But historically, adult ed programs, when they have tried out and developed learner leadership activities, they've often focused on involving learners in student committees or advisory groups or boards, as recruiters, as advocates and awareness raisers to the public and so forth, as I mentioned earlier, or as unpaid or paid staff. But Um, and that's fine. Those are good activities in themselves, and they can help learners develop skills, leadership skills, and positive attitudes, self-efficacy, collaboration, planning kind of abilities, cooperation skills that they can apply outside their programs. But my argument here and in the paper that I wrote is that this concept of learner leadership development shouldn't just stop at these things that go on within the program, but be extended more intentionally and seen as a key purpose of our programs. I mean, you could make the argument that these programs in many ways are leadership development programs for those who are interested in taking on more active roles outside the program. And learner leadership can be applied in all aspects of a program that learners are involved in. So sort of setting a standard, putting the message out there that this is in effect the kind of thing that Eric mentioned earlier that Make the Road is doing. That they have a Learner Leadership Academy, and they see themselves as supportive of this kind of learner leadership. So that said, let me move into this question of how might participatory AFE and learner leadership be part of a community-oriented approach to adult foundational education. And by community-oriented, I'm using a term that a colleague of mine and ours, Hannah Fingeret, raised and suggested back in about 1995. She's no longer working in the field, but she's sort of in a retirement phase. But she argued pretty much for, I think, what we're talking about here now. And there has been concern within our field that we are very focused on, we haven't focused sufficiently on learner needs beyond employment preparation. And this is a major focus of so many funders and programs. This is not a bad thing, but it can be sort of a narrow definition of what we should be doing in our field. So, I'm not going to be able to give you all the details of what I mean by community oriented here, but in a nutshell, a community oriented approach would have a focus more directly on empowering learners, as well as empowering us as adult educators, and empowering other partners that we might work with, public health agencies or other groups that can support adult learners to collectively collaborate to more effectively help adult learners manage opportunities and challenges in diverse contexts or communities that, where we live. So similarly, in keeping with that, community-oriented programs would structure instructional and other activities to better equip learners to, as we've just been saying, be able to be effective problem solvers in the various contexts that they work in. So, and more intentionally thinking about what's the purpose? Why do people come into these programs? I mean, they want to improve their lives in some form or another. I don't think they're that. I mean, there's some people think, well, I just want a GED. But if you ask them, this question of why you want a GED, I mean, then they start telling you more like, well, I need it for a better job. Well, why do you need a better job? Well, I need to be able to support my family and pay my bills. Why do you need to do that? I mean, if you dig a bit deeper, people will tell you what their motivations are. Why are they coming? And why do they see adult ed as a tool for them? And a community-oriented approach would really be seen as a way to serve more learners, make it clear that you are trying to respond to a broad range of learner needs. You want to listen to what they say and actively involve them in the process of learning and improving their lives. So, in a nutshell, as I said earlier, I think participatory practices and learner leadership activities can be important ways to empower learners as problem solvers. So let me get to the fourth question. How might you adapt these concepts in your work in New Jersey? And my sense is, from a limited comments I've been able to hear from you, is that some of you are already trying to do this kind of thing. And here's some suggestions. This is based on my own work and study of what other people have been doing around the country. If you want to do this, my guess is those of you who are interested in making your programs more learner-centered and participatory, and possibly focused on this idea of learner leadership development, that you should be working with others who have a similar interest. It's hard to do this work on your own. Think about some projects that you might carry out within your program, or maybe across programs in your community or others you work with in the state, in which you can share and further develop these kind of participatory activities and learner leadership activities. And don't try to, I think it's smart to do your homework and to better understand that models that you might adapt. And that's really what this document I mentioned earlier is all about, is to try to identify reports, handbooks, initiatives that you might tap into for ideas rather than have to start from scratch. And our field is really very guilty of continually reinventing the wheel and not doing it very well, unfortunately. I think people aren't really maximizing their efficiency by just trying to reinvent these ideas all the time. You can pilot your own versions of these practices. Think of these as projects where your demonstration or mini pilot projects in which you are trying out this new kind of curriculum or this activity with students, and share, reflect on what you're learning, share what you've learned, and use that as a basis for continuing to do this kind of work, and educate funders and policymakers and other supporters about the potential of these kind of practices and how they can support them. So go about this in a systematic way. I know that sounds like a lot of work, and it is a lot of work, and I acknowledge that. And we need to be supported to be able to do this kind of quality improvement initiatives. And similarly, though, in terms of getting support for this, again, I think those within your county or your community or your within the state, work with others who have this kind of perspective, and are interested in incorporating this into the work in the field. Advocate for these kinds of supports, funding for pilot projects, professional development for people who want to do this work, research, tap into research and evaluation resources in the state and say, can you monitor this? Can you help us evaluate these things? And document what's working? There are great models around the country of states that have taken this kind of approach to system reform and introduction of these kind of student-centered practices. But also understand realistically that innovation and system change can be both rewarding but also very difficult. And there are sources of resistance. I mean, a lot of people don't have the time or the interest or the background, or really they shared the values that would support this kind of model. And not saying they're bad people, but I mean, that's just, in any profession, there are different levels of understanding and interest in these kind of ideas. So be aware you might run into some obstacles along the way. But that's why it's important to kind of work collectively with others that can do this kind of work, so you can maximize your input and impact. So with that said, I know it looks like we have only about 10 or 12 minutes left, I think. I welcome your questions and comments and suggestions.
All right, thanks. Well, Paul, while folks are kind of gathering their questions or thoughts, I will say that one of the things that the NJALL can offer, right, is that in addition to having our annual conference, we also have the capacity to have webinars. We've done webinars in the past. And if there was a group of people that were particularly interested in this, to make sure that the wheel wasn't getting reinvented and to make sure that resources were being shared more efficiently, then folks could use NJALL as a hub for that, right? That like you could reach out to us and we could connect people with each other, and throughout the year start to have that conversation so people aren't siloed in various parts of the state. Because we know that conferences and workshops don't lead to teacher change as much as collaboratively working on
Right.
a project does,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
so if people wanted to work on this and identified like-minded people, NGO would certainly be happy to provide both the infrastructure and a platform for people to come together to talk about these types of things, right? So it takes a shared space, it takes shared time. Bandwidth is always an issue, right? But you don't have to reinvent a commons, right? NJALL can be the commons for people who wanted to come together to talk about this.
I think that's terrific.
All right, other thoughts, questions people have about applying the idea of learner leadership into the classroom? All right, Suzanne wants to know, can you put up the slide for question 4, part 2, back up for a minute. All right.
That one?
Yep. Suzanne, you got a question about that or a thought about that? Paul, and I think as you mentioned that I had not heard that Value had closed up shop, but certainly, we could learn from Value's experience and think about building, similar organizations that grow out of that. Not do Value again, right? Value, ran its course probably for a reason. And then, but what's next? There's a question from Rishan about doing this in online classrooms. I think Rishan, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Paul, I have some thoughts, but Paul, if you
Yeah.
want to.
I don't have a magic answer. I think that's one of those kind of questions that a group could look at. And I think there are people around the country that are, struggling with this. I mean, both the potential and challenges of online learning, even as we see it right here. I mean, it's hard to have a discussion via Zoom, I think, in many ways.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think I don't have a quick answer, but maybe Eric, you do.
Well, there's two things that I think of, Rishan. So one is that I think for online classes to have more hangout time is really, really important, right? So that it's not just, 90 minutes or 2 hours or an hour or whatever it might be. You turn it on and the teacher's like, here's a do now and da 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 da.
Right.
Because we don't do that in in-person classes, right? The way that we develop a rapport with each other is hanging out and, pardon my French, shooting the shit, right? And so that like creating times for shooting the breeze, that's an easy way to say it without swearing, shooting the breeze. With in online classes, you got to create times for that. So for example, in all my online classes, whether my Make the Road New Jersey classes or actually when I'm teaching at Montclair State, I'm always on like 15 minutes before the class starts. Just so when students pop in, talk about how you doing, how's your kids doing, see any good movies, what about that game last night? And then at the end of the class, I always hang around like another 10 minutes or so and don't run away, right? So again, it's an issue of bandwidth if you've got that time to do that, but I make sure that I build that time in so that there's time when we're not sort of on task, academic task, and we're doing this sort of rapport building. The other thing that I've done at Make the Road, since the pandemic started, all my classes have been online, but I've attended, like May Day rallies and things like that and met my students at the rallies. So I've seen my students in person in real places at events that they're participating in and that they care about, right? And so then that further builds up the rapport that I have with the students. And so then when we're in class, I can refer to them and I know who's comfortable talking about certain things because I've talked to them kind of offline, right? And in person. So even if the whole class is not meeting outside, right? trying to create opportunities to be co-located with your students, to use a business term, I think is important. So, I mean, it's not a magic bullet, right? But I think spending that time to create the rapport so people can feel like they're part of a group and not just dropping in and dropping out, I think is super important.
I agree.
Suzanne's mentioning feedback options at critical module. So Moodle ML. So if you have a learning management system, whether it's Moodle or whatever else it might be, Google Classroom, like, building in feedback that you actually respond to, right? So it's not, doesn't just go into cyberspace, right? But students get a sense that you're building it in that way. One of the things that I do in my classes, because I let the students, well, I want to make sure that the students' own advocacy goals are driving the curriculum and not mine. I use polls, right? In the beginning of the semester, in the beginning of the class, I'll be like, what are things that you guys care about? And then I'll poll them and be like, all right, what advocacy campaign do you want to work on? And so that the students themselves choose what we're going to be studying, right? In that way. And Niala says that they go bowling with their students. That's awesome. I would love to go bowling with my students. I keep telling my students I want to get a soccer game together, right? Because that would be like a really, really good community thing.
Good way to tear your ACL too.
Yeah. Don't jinx me. Don't jinx me.
Yeah. So on that note about just in general, online sharing and communication, forget about adult basic skills students. I mean, I've been involved from the very beginning of various national and other kind of listservs or discussion groups. And we often struggle, those groups often struggle with participation of the people that sign up for these discussions. Oh, let's have this discussion. And I think some of us at one point, sat down and analyzed, why is it that people might not participate? And, one is that the topics might not be interesting. Another is just that they're busy doing other stuff. Third is that they might not be comfortable using, I mean, in this case, you're asking people to type stuff, and put it out there in the public, and they might be shy about, they're not comfortable with writing, or spelling, or what they think, or taking a risk, sending something out and it could be sent all over the world and embarrass them, etc. So there's a level of trust and comfort with communication. And do you trust the group, etc. So I would think those same kind of variables would impact, adult learners who come to your programs. I mean, they have to trust you and they have to feel comfortable typing stuff. And I agree that with a Zoom call, you have the advantage, you can use oral communications, but there has to be a level of trust. And it's pretty much what Eric said, I think, providing a forum in which people can focus on discussions on topics they're interested in talking about and have a purpose, and so they don't feeling they're wasting their time or putting themselves at risk of being embarrassed. So, I think once you've established a class and a learning group, some of that trust stuff and focal questions might be somewhat resolved, but still there are inhibitors, I think, of communicating online as well. These are good questions.
Yeah, I mean, as part of that too, is like the trust thing is not recording, right? So like making sure that if people are, putting themselves out there, that you're not recording it in some way, right? So that they know that you're not documenting it. If they're undocumented themselves, like they want to make sure that if they speak up in your class, that it couldn't potentially put them in harm's way, right? In terms of that kind of stuff. So I think that's important. Yeah. There's some other examples of like learning CPR and introducing them to health nights at the hospitals and going out to eat with their students. I think that health nights at the hospital is really important, right? Because in the previous session, one of the things that came up is that a lot of our students don't avail themselves of all the benefits that are, that they have. And so to encourage the students to really take advantage of the things that are out there, sometimes we need to be that bridge, right? between opportunities. And it's possible that, you know, if you're thinking about health nights in the hospitals, right, that
Mhm.
one of the students, if they're particularly interested in this, could then take the lead with other students, you know, to
Yep.
bring them back to the hospital or
Yep.
introduce them to the hospital, so that it's
Yeah.
always the teacher, but a student who's particularly interested in healthcare as an issue, you know, could
Yep.
take the lead on that.
Let me just
Mm.
quickly say, one among the resources that I cited in this document been referring to uh, is what we call a can-do guide that focuses on partnerships between supporters of public health and adult foundational ed programs. And there's a lot of examples along the lines of what you're saying, Eric. There's some great models. And it's also health is a common, everybody has to worry about be concerned about their health and that of their families and so forth. It's a common issue that probably impacts every learner, and it's a positive kind of thing that could be the focus for some really nice group activities, including leadership related activities. Um, so I'll just say that I'm looking at the time here. I respect that people need to move on. I just want to wrap up and just say thank you for this opportunity. I really want to encourage you, and there's no PowerPoint slide here that I'm following as a script. I genuinely think that New Jersey has such wonderful potential. As I mentioned, I worked in the field. Many of the examples that I cited in my session yesterday about community oriented came out of New Jersey. I didn't specify these were from where they were from in New Jersey, but a lot of these models of student or participatory education and learner leadership have been developed in New Jersey and worked on. And I think there's a great potential, great people in the state, clearly a huge population of adult learners, different types of adult learner populations that could benefit from our services. I think, I can't speak what's going on in New Jersey now because I haven't been in this state for roughly 10 years now, actually more, 11 years. Um, but I think unfortunately adult ed, like in many states, hasn't always gotten the respect and the support it needs. I think NJALL is a wonderful resource. As I understand it, Literacy New Jersey is another great statewide resource. Jessica's on the call here. There are great people around the state that can really, they're great resources, I'll put it that way. And I really appreciate your interest. I'm happy to communicate further. And I really encourage you in your work because it's really important.
All right. Thanks, Paul. So actually I have a podcast that I do, and I did an episode with Paul. I don't know, Paul, was it like 6 months ago or something? And one of the main topics that we talked about was historical amnesia within the field of adult education, right? And I think that's a really important point, right? That people do good work and then it sort of goes unrecognized and undiscovered, and then people spend the time to go through the whole process again, right? So it's important to look at the models that have worked, look at the models that haven't and how to tweak them, but we're not starting from scratch ever, and I think adult ed would benefit from knowing its own history a little bit better. So I dropped the link in the chat if you need the PD certificate for this session. Paul is going to forward me the PowerPoints for this, and it's after the conference is over. I will send the materials will be available to everybody. And certainly if this is a topic of interest to you, reach out to us at our email address, the NJALL email address. We can try to pull something together throughout the year and not just at the conference. All right. So thanks, Paul, for yesterday and for today, for sharing your expertise, your insight, and your institutional memory of the field.
Thank you.